We had to quickly analyze the EIR and be able to do comments in a very shortened timeline. And again, for us as a health organization and many of the communities that we work with, we would like to see CEQA strengthened because CEQA does not require specific analysis of health impacts. We use traffic and air quality and noise and these other things as proxies for understanding what the direct health impacts. And I think that this is a really important area of advocacy, given sort of the nature of health inequity and disparities where your zip code determines your life expectancy. A tool like CEQA then becomes incredibly important to strengthen. There are no direct health impact assessments that are required. Some projects get them, some don't. And then a comprehensive analysis of cumulative impacts, because the way we permit and allow projects, but also industry to function is sort of one project at a time, not looking at the cumulative impacts that a project will have on a community or an individual's health. And so our case study with Farmers Field is really, a lot of us learning how to read through 10,000 pages, finding the kind of resources we needed to help us with the traffic analysis, but also the negotiation. And so that was a really quick turnaround and learning experience. But I also want to, I know that I saw the RSVPs and there's many folks on the phone. There's folks from SAGE, Strategic Action for a Just Economy, who've done some also really wonderful work being able to use sort of the discovery portions of CEQA to then engage on large community planning processes. And that includes the expansion of the USC area. The University of California had its expansion master plan, and how the communities use CEQA as a way of understanding what was in that plan, but also to engage with USC to push back on how USC as an institution is transforming what used to be a low-income Latino immigrant community. But also CEQA has been used, the very famous case with the coming of the shuttle to Exposition Park and the Science Museum. CEQA was used to protect the trees that were being cut, and these were old canopy trees. Folks in the City of Commerce have also used CEQA to protect tree canopies. So there's a number of ways that communities end up using this to protect communities. And I don't. Do you want to go?
Sure. Back to me for going to the 2013 legislative overview. And I think Martha and I will probably go back and forth on this a little bit. I'm going to start with a little bit of context. So let's not kid ourselves. Almost since that mammoth decision in 1972, folks have wanted to weaken CEQA. And there have been constant attacks on CEQA. And frankly, CEQA, as a result, has been one of the most amended laws we have. Literally hundreds of sections have been amended of CEQA, generally for the worse, making the law more confusing, less responsive to communities and the environment, less protective of the environment, sometimes to strengthen it, but usually not the case. That has been hundreds of sections since the law was passed, but that continues to be expedited in recent years. And we really, in the last few years, have had a perfect storm of things coming together that have really put CEQA at risk. The bad economy being, first and foremost. Whenever the economy goes down, you always want to see people, who want to deregulate things, have more leverage. See that at the national and the state level, and that's certainly in play. But you've got Governor Brown, who, when he was mayor of Oakland, he wanted to do some infill. There were some community groups that stood up on community issues and historic preservation issues. He felt CEQA got in the way from his vision of what Oakland should look like, which is, frankly, what CEQA is supposed to do, is empower communities. As a result, he has had a hankering to weaken CEQA. So even though you've got a Democrat in the governor's office, he is certainly no friend of CEQA, and I've put a couple of his quotes on the PowerPoint. Never seen a CEQA exemption he didn't like, and CEQA reform is the Lord's work. That changes the entire dynamic in the legislature when they see the governor and a Democratic governor wanting to see CEQA weaken. The legislature, too, I think partly because of term limits and less understanding of the importance of environmental laws, we're seeing fewer and fewer champions. You're getting more and more bills each session. Now it's literally dozens of bills each session that are looking to weaken CEQA. a lot of those bills, it's the chipping away. The actual full-out assault you don't see, but it's the chipping away of our laws, and that it's not only in environmental. You see this in all sorts of progressive laws and social welfare laws, and it really is the death of a thousand cuts, and it makes it harder for people to stand up. And so when you've seen these laws like the special exemptions for the Farmers Field football stadium, we're not losing close votes. I mean, we're losing 90 to 20, 100 to 20, and oftentimes the 20 we get, half of those are made up from Republicans who say that we should just do away with CEQA and that these exemptions don't go far enough, so they vote in principle against them. So, it's getting to a point where there's only really a dozen or so folks you can point to that are going to stand up for CEQA. The chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee about a year and a half ago, Joe Simitian, said he had been in the legislature for a long, long time. He was a pre-term limit guy, that CEQA reform was at an all-time fever pitch in the Capitol. And frankly, I think the environmental community and the broader community really sort of fed into this. In a bad economy, we're sort of duck and cover. Hopefully things don't get too bad. And I think there's it's a human nature that we always want to focus on the newer law. What's the newest, most exciting thing, SB 375 or AB 32 or cap and trade? And you forget to protect the important laws we have. And I think no law has been more important over the last 4 decades shaping California's communities and future than CEQA, and yet it really got short shrift, and it allowed this sort of momentum against CEQA to come to a head. And you also had the sort of perfect champion of CEQA reform, Senator Rubio, who got very close to folks that wanted, for a long time have been trying to weaken CEQA. And he tried in 2012 a last-minute gut and amend, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, that would have totally gutted CEQA. It said, well, CEQA is a great law, but we've had all these newer, better laws that have come into place since CEQA. So if you've got any existing standard, CEQA no longer applies, and you can't base a challenge based on CEQA. So you theoretically go through an environmental review, but if you already have an air quality standard, then CEQA doesn't apply to air quality. If you have a water quality, it doesn't apply to water quality. If you've got a general plan, even if it's 30 years old and, god awful, that still trumps CEQA. So, he talked about it as CEQA reform. There wasn't anybody who looked at it that said this wasn't the end of CEQA. And the scary thing is, in 2012, with the last-minute shenanigans that happened in the Capitol, we think if this had gone to the floor of the Senate, it would have become law, that we would have lost CEQA in a last-minute gut and amend, kind of legislative play. And luckily, even though we don't always eye to eye with the pro tem on many things with Steinberg, he said, no, we're not going to end CEQA on a gut and amend bill without proper hearing. We're going to slow up. But we were probably one vote away from losing CEQA in 2012. Now, the good thing that happened as a result of that is it forced us finally to really mobilize. And that's what we tried to do in 13. And I wouldn't count 13 as an entirely positive CEQA success story, but I think it certainly had a lot of highlights that we can point to. The first thing is we finally actually got mobilized. PCL organized the CEQA Works Coalition. We had 200 community-based groups. The legislature doesn't usually see 200 logos coming in on things, and that was really important. We were organizing regular updates, calls, emailing blasts, doing media, putting together fact sheets, collecting CEQA success stories from up and down the state, publishing them on the CEQA Works website, developing better materials around CEQA, and all of this stuff we could even be doing a better job. But for the first time, we got mobilized. Secondly, we actually put forward a proactive legislative agenda. Again, we've been playing defense for so long, and frankly, I'm so sick of it. We wanted to actually get out in front of things, and we pushed a number of bills. Some of them were very basic kind of reforms, more electronic filings, things that could make things a little cheaper and quicker. Some of them a little bit more, forward thinking, trying to get translation of CEQA documents when you have non-English speaking communities, things like that. One of the most important things was something called the Bayona fix. For 20 or 30 years, it has been the established law in CEQA that you look at things like if you're going to build a development, in a floodplain or near sea level rise or on an earthquake fault or near wildfires, you have to assess that because you could have huge impacts on the community. A court in a case called Biona Wetlands, a court said no, CEQA is supposed to be looking at the impact of a project on the environment, not the impact of the environment on a project. Therefore, we no longer need to assess these grave public safety threats. So we try to push a bill that would overturn that legal decision. We also started bringing different constituencies together, like infill proponents and EJ and equity groups, to see if we could come up with ideas to promote more infill, but do it in a way that is actually going to be protective of communities. And of course, playing our normal defense on bills. So I think for the first time in a long time, we're starting to get organized. And then what happened was we saw the legislature do what the legislature does best. So one of the things, we knew Senator Steinberg wanted to push an omnibus CEQA bill. He made that commitment to Senator Rubio back last year when he killed Rubio's bill from going from the floor. In trade for that, he said he would push a comprehensive CEQA reform package this session. He appointed Senator Rubio as the chair of Senate Environmental Quality, which gave a lot of us concern. Luckily, that concern was alleviated when Senator Rubio, in the middle of session, abruptly resigned to go to Chevron, which did not surprise a lot of us because we knew Chevron and Walmart were some of the big forces pushing for a lot of this CEQA reform. So he had wanted to push the big omnibus package, and he actually he introduced bill language relatively early. He wanted to clear the playing field, so all those bills that PCL had worked on, we made them out of the Assembly. They moved over to the Senate, and they all stalled and got turned into two-year bills because the senator really wanted to be the person leading on CEQA reform. We worked with him extensively through the session, and early on, this happens with bills. 731, it started off very, very broad, which freaked everybody out. It had this intent language relating to massive sweeping overhaul. Then they put in the specific language, which was all, frankly, pretty mild initially. There's some things that gave us concern, but they were kind of very technical fixes on court procedures and things like that. Then, as it kind of continued to go through the session, he started putting more and more to promote more infill development, which is obviously a big priority of his, to tie in more to SB 375. This is where a lot of our work came in, saying, look, if you're going to put in the infill, you've got to put in provisions relating to displacement and some of the community impacts and addressing equity concerns. And actually, in the last week of session, a lot of that language got put in. But then you also had, at the same time, and I know Mother wants to get in, I'll just finish my one thing and hand it over. Then what happened is you had this sort of parallel track, which was about a week before the end of session, the senator introduced a bill to give the Sacramento Kings Arena tremendous streamlining, CEQA streamlining. And that was done in a gut and amend. And for anybody who doesn't know what that is, it's the way the legislature does business now. It's kind of a sucker's bet to actually introduce your bill through the session the way it's supposed to be done and go through all the hearings. You wait until the last week or two of session when it's the Wild West in Sacramento. You find some bill that either never went anywhere or is near death or didn't really have many provisions, can relate to anything. There doesn't need to be any nexus, and you just pull all the language out and you put a whole bunch of other language in. It doesn't give anybody in the community a chance to review, to vet it, to mobilize, so you're always on guard. So even though we know the pro tem has wanted CEQA streamlining for the Kings Arena because he's from Sacramento, he's wanted to do that for 2 years, we didn't actually see any language until a week before the end of session. Did you want to add?
Well, yes. I mean, we were tracking this, and we went to, one of the first committee hearings and had a letter, opposing SB 731, and we felt sort of early on that there was some very problematic language from a social justice and equity perspective around the infill and transit-oriented development. And we also knew that And I did not appreciate what a political master Mr. Steinberg is until we till this end of this session, because it was very masterful. So we, early on we were the only group to show up to oppose, along with a number of groups from South Los Angeles, from the Central Valley, and others. Pretty much most of the major environmental justice organizations signed on and were opposing this. And then we started to do our visits, and then people were like, well, this isn't really not, the intent language is going to go away. So there was a huge lack of clarity, which often sort of made our organizing and our district work a little difficult, because everybody would sort of laugh, well, we know he wants a stadium, and we know something will happen at the end of session. And so I think one of the most important lessons that we learned is what he did, and why that graphic is there, is that the elements of 731 that many groups had spent the whole year negotiating around, including this concession around displacement language. And at first, the displacement language was that would it actually require the OPR,
Office of Planning and Research,
Office of Planning and Research, to actually study displacement and develop recommendations. That was a strong language, and that even in those last few days of session, that kept getting weakened. And so what happened, and I think this is a really important political lesson, is be careful what you negotiate, because what he did is those things where there was agreement within the environmental community, he took those pieces from 731 and put them in SB 431, and in some ways to say there's consensus about these. And so we're running around the last days of in the Capitol, and people are pissed off at us because we're still saying, no, I think we should oppose this. And people are like, well, you've gotten the displacement language, and well, as we often say, that was not enough for our communities. And so some of the work that we did in preparation, to educate legislators, and in fact, the Senator's office asked us to put together a policy briefing on this issues around infill and equity, and then there was the group that was also meeting of infill developers. And so I think we did a good job of sort of communicating what these tensions are, and that some of the fixes are both at the state level, but many of these fixes around infill and transit-oriented development are local fixes. So I just wanted to make sure we added that. And we did a lot of visits, not nearly as many as we should have. And we'll talk a little more about sort of what we have to do for this year and next year.
Yeah, so I'll, just to add on to that, this is a slide I always like to put in, because we have this myth of the way the legislature works, and it's very pensive and thoughtful, and in reality it's much more close to the picture on the right, Edvard Munch, the Scream. It is, if you've never experienced the last few days of session, I would advise everyone should do it to see democracy at work at its finest in the Capitol. And Marta already started to give some of the preview of what ended up happening at the end of session, which was, we know the priority of Steinberg was getting the King's deal through. We know that the governor really, even more than Steinberg, really wanted to promote infill. And it was really our side of the community that wanted to push the displacement piece in there. The understanding we have, and nobody knows because it's all rumor and innuendo, is the governor said, I'm only going to sign one CEQA bill, so Gerald, if you want your King stuff, it better be in the same as infill, because I'm going to sign one CEQA bill, and it's going to have provisions relating to promoting infill. So that was the impetus of Steinberg saying, okay, he basically gutted his own bill, 731. He moved it all into this Kings Arena bill that had been a gut and amend in its own right a few days prior. And that bill alone has huge concerns. It does two things to CEQA. It limits the public comment period, which is very concerning, but even more importantly, it takes away injunctive relief. Well, the way CEQA works, if CEQA never says you can't build a project, it says you have to go through the proper environmental review. If a court finds that you don't go through the proper environmental review, all that it can do is say, we're not going to let you build a project, we're going to put injunctive relief on until you go back and do the proper review. If you can't do injunctive relief, then a project will just move forward despite having improper public review. What's the good of CEQA? I mean, it really does render it a meaningless law. And you can say, well, it's just one arena, it's a Kings arena, and if you're from Sacramento, you want to keep the Kings, and it's downtown, and maybe it can revitalize things, and again, you want to forget about the communities that are already existing there. The problem is you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once you have this precedent set of no injunctive relief, we know the governor wants that for high-speed rail. We suspect the governor wants that for the peripheral delta tunnels to bring more water from north to south. You can imagine this being applied to a whole host of other projects. So that alone would have caused our groups to oppose 743. In terms of the infill provisions, which are broader than the King's, this was the piece of 731 that got pulled over. It does a lot to promote infill. If you're an infill advocate, it's actually a really good bill. You have to look at alternative methodologies to level of service, and you take away parking as an impact and limit the challenges to aesthetics. So there's a lot that relates to doing more infill. The big problem is, we had been working around this language that said, okay, if you're going to do more infill, you have to address the displacement issue, you have to address the equity issue, and conveniently, because that wasn't a top priority for the governor or the pro tem, that was the piece that made it out. So you don't have this counterbalance. You've cherry-picked. And that was why a lot of groups ended up, the first time seeing this graphic, opposed, in the end, virtually everybody opposed 743. It was bad process. It was all about the sort of pay-to-play, King's Arena. If you're a multimillionaire or billionaire, you can get special treatment under the law. If you're a community in an area that's going to be impacted, your concerns don't get addressed. It was gut and amend at the last second. So we're, horrible process, horrible precedent being set, and again, none of that community protection that we wanted to see in the law. Now, that being said, I do have to say, the call that I got, the first call I got from the media when session ended was, how does the environmental community feel having won this battle around CEQA? Because when the year started and it looked like Senator Rubio was going to gut CEQA and end it, and you do have to keep that perspective. From where we started the year, things could have ended up a whole lot worse. And it was because of all the efforts that we did, even though I think a lot more is needed. That being said, I certainly don't feel like I won. Martha, do you feel like you won?
Oh, God, no.
So there's still a lot more to do. So in terms of what's next, I'm going to talk very briefly about the insider stuff and then hand over to Martha for the more outside, which I think is more important. Now that this law has passed 743 and been signed into law, it directs the Office of Planning and Research to develop these guidelines to promote more infill. It's imperative that we stay involved in that process. At the same time, CEQA itself has to undergo review of its guidelines every few years, and for the last 2 decades, those have been very minor. The governor has already said this is going to be the most comprehensive review and reform of the guidelines, which is sort of the way CEQA gets implemented, that we've seen in at least 2 decades. It is absolutely vital that the environmental community is at the table. And the first hearing on that, my group, PCL, was the only environmental group at that hearing, and that just can't be the case. We've got to address the equity issues that got left out of 743. We've got to keep pushing those positive legislative ideas. I'm tired of playing defense. I want to continue to play offense. All those bills that Steinberg held up in the Senate, they're all 2-year bills that we're going to be working on. We don't have any bandwidth to work on other bills, but there's a lot of ideas that we're hoping other groups will push, including the health assessment that Martha mentioned. And we got to just continue working to educate members and tracking I'm sure a couple dozen bills that are going to be coming, because trust me, the groups that wanted to see CEQA gutted, and they could have put on the happy face and said, well, this is about promoting more renewables or green development. The groups behind those efforts, it's Chevron, it's Walmart, it's the big guys that don't want to have to pay the bills for their development, and they're not going to be appeased by 743. They're going to keep coming, so we're going to have to be a lot more organized. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
So this is many of these graphics are, I love this one, this is actually from an African campaign around government accountability. We are watching you, and this is primarily how we're looking at what we have to do over the next few months and into the next session is that there will be opportunities to engage and for social justice and equity voices to voice their concerns and start figuring out what are these fixes, since we weren't able to win some of the anti-displacement and social equity demands that we were making. And what we had been demanding is that, we need to have the needs and rights of existing residents and communities targeted by infill and TOD protected. We should minimize and eliminate ethnic and racial disparities existing in those communities, health disparities. We should actively reduce socioeconomic inequality and promote and maintain mixed income neighborhoods. So this is a set of principles that we've been working on. It should promote the use of transit and multimodal transportation for core transit riders. We should reduce exposure to air pollution and other toxins, particularly in vulnerable communities. It should advance health and well-being of existing residents. It should enhance access to quality, affordable health care, and it should enhance equitable economic development characterized by good jobs in designated low-income and designated for low-income workers, and finding other wealth-generating opportunities for low-income residents. And these were the kind of arguments that actually really resonated with elected officials. And so I think a major campaign has to be to educate legislators around these tensions between infill TOD and what that means in low-income communities, where, yes, we need housing, and yes, we need jobs, and how do you balance this set of interests? And the other part is that as more of these CEQA exemptions drive decisions to the local level, how do we in local communities, strengthen Los Angeles' planning department? So that's another area where we can have a lot of advocacy at the local level. So there's the community plans and those updates that are occurring right now, and a number of groups in Los Angeles and other areas are actually working on these. Then we're very excited about this idea of really engaging local communities and organizing and advocacy and talking to legislators. The biggest lesson I learn every year of end of session is if we are not watching them, mischief will ensue. And I think the idea that folks in local communities are watching them is different for them. And it is incredibly different when you're in a room full of lobbyists and folks from LA Can are there, or folks from SAGE are there, and community members. And even with our being there, we were often, because of sort of how the politics worked, some of our community members weren't able to speak at some of the hearings because they were so deft at sort of eliminating those opportunities. So fighting for those opportunities are really, really incredibly important. And the other area that I think, says that we are moving the needle, and sometimes I get like, we didn't win everything and I'm really mad and it's all terrible. And then you realize you're able to look back a few days later and say, well, we are moving the needle. So in large part because of the work around SB 375 and many groups, the California Air Resources Board has commissioned and funded a study on displacement. The folks from SAGE, LA Can, and PSR were actually able to meet with the staff at the Air District and who are doing the study, and there are many opportunities for us to continue to engage. They'll be looking at Los Angeles County and San Francisco County and looking at these, a fairly large study, and I think that those are great opportunities for communities to engage and have their voices heard. PSRLA and a number of other groups will be trying to figure out exactly how we move forward, how do we start mobilizing and organizing, and I'm going to answer one of the questions.
I was going to answer that question.
CEQA is a totally new area for me, but I would like to use it as a tool for EJ advocacy. For someone who's looking for CEQA 101, where do I suggest you go? We suggest you go to Bruce Resnick, who does CEQA Trainings 101. We've also done a CEQA 101 training for community members. And so you should definitely reach out to either one of us, but definitely Bruce, who's got a lot of the materials already established for how CEQA works and how you can use that as a tool. And again, the other lesson really from this end of session is this idea of accountability, and that often the perspective and needs of communities are not being addressed in Sacramento, and often because things look very different in Sacramento. In Sacramento, it's, you're maintaining relationships with legislators, you need to operate in that, and it becomes quite a vacuum. And having community voices there reminds you what is at stake. So what does it mean to lose a displacement language? It means that we will continue to have transit-oriented development that displaces people. We will have, large transformations of communities. And one of the things we found when we did the health impact assessment around the stadium was that in Pico Union and South Park, traditionally African American and Latino communities, those were our communities were moving out of those. They were being pushed out of their communities, and you actually started to see the stats change. And so you have more older folks, more younger white students who are from USC moving into these luxury apartments and some of the lower income apartments, and then folks end up in their cars driving more. So we know that, and that story is incredibly important. But beyond having that story, I think one of the things that we need to do better is articulate the response. So we would go talk to legislators, and we're really good about articulating the problem, but they want, well, give me language for the bill that I can fix. And I think that's one area where we hope over the next few months we do a lot better about being proactive. We want health impact assessments. Here's the kind of language and action that we want around these issues of displacement and gentrification.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. Trying to read the questions that are coming through. Let me first go to. Wait. How do I go back? Okay. So I'm going to get to the questions in a second. I just want to mention a few things what you guys can do on the phone. One relates to a question that we already had and something Marta brought up, which is PCL does do community workshops on CEQA. They are the kind of 101. They're all day. We generally try to get a sponsor because we're a very small organization for about $1,000 to host it. But we're actually looking for grants that will allow us to work and do these workshops. So they're phenomenal. We work with about a dozen CEQA attorneys up and down the state, so we can do these things anywhere. So you can follow up with me, viewer 21 or whomever had emailed that. Send us your positive CEQA examples. We have the CEQA Works website, and I really encourage everybody to. Encourage everybody to join the CEQA Works Coalition, which is CEQAWorks.org, and send us success stories so we can go on. Ideas for improving CEQA. Really, just being part of the movement. I mean, I can't stress enough, being somebody who came from local activism and now works in Sacramento, there is this sense in Sacramento you are in a bubble and you think you've got all this power, and really the people that are going to move the members that have to vote are in district, because most of these members fly up from LA or San Diego or wherever they're coming from. They're in Sacramento a few days. We don't actually have nearly the relationship with them that we think we do in Sacramento, and it's really when they go back home and have to answer to their constituents that you really have that influence. So the more we can make this a bottoms-up movement influencing Sacramento, the better. So with that, I think we've got the next half hour for Q&A, and we've got a bunch of ones really coming in that I'm going to try to read off of.
So I'm going to... If you can do viewer 16, because I think I have some of that. So there's a question, even when local community groups are present and testify at hearings, wearing T-shirts, carrying signs, I've seen even the most progressive legislators vote yes on CEQA exemptions. It's maddening and disheartening. And what else can we do besides engage more communities in the legislature? Boy, I feel you, whoever that one is. We might have been in the same rooms together. So I think... Here, I think it's really sort of fascinating. So if you're talking about sort of local, what happens when somebody outside of a community decides a project is important? So there are these catalytic, transformative projects, these green projects, and these are the kinds of projects that are in the queue for streamlining. I think there's two places for that battle to happen: at the local planning department. A serious accountability campaign with the City of Los Angeles Planning Department, I think is important. We've just in the last few days we've heard, they didn't require seismic testing for the Millennium projects. There's these large projects, so there's a bit of holding planning agencies accountable to measuring the impacts, I think, is one. The other is sort of organizing early to make sure that we're talking to those elected officials, and I think the other part is really engaging base building groups, because we don't have money, but we have power to vote. And so if if electeds know that there will be a price to be paid for a bad vote, and the price isn't just bad media, but it's that the community organizations that do the get out the vote, that walk the precincts for those folks, that are their constituents, we need to strengthen that. We need to do a better job of that. Otherwise, we don't have a whole lot of leverage because we're not the ones donating to their campaigns. And this is the challenge with the moderate Democrats, is that they come from poorer districts, and who's giving them money to run is not always the residents and the voters. So there is this challenge around accountability.
So I'm going to answer. Somebody asked. I had really went over the specific plan language. I skipped over it in 743, the bill that became law, and so that was the other provision that has given some level of concern. So one thing just to note. This applies only to transit priority areas, and again, it's this focus on trying to get more infill. So if you have a transit priority area, and that area already has adopted a specific plan, then basically you don't have to go, and a project is consistent with that specific plan. You have a very cursory environmental review. It's nothing like a full CEQA environmental review. I would say it almost, you don't have to do any kind of meaningful review. And the notion is, I kind of understand the notion, which is if you go through and you really plan your community well, and then you already have laid out everything in that stage. Do you have to go through each project individually, or can that sort of serve as more of a master EIR that applies to the projects? There already was that kind of streamlining for residential projects. So what 743 did was expand it from just residential areas to mixed-use, commercial, and employment center projects. And this actually gave the environmental community some concern, just because it was rushed through and we didn't really have a chance to vet it as much as we would like. There's some concern whether, what if you have a very outdated specific plan, or there's been new information. There wasn't a lot of language related to that. There was actually some even worse language that we got out of there that said that even if your specific plan was back from 1980, it would apply. We actually got them to pull a date out, because at least that gives us a fighting chance to say it needs to be relevant. But this one actually really upset a lot of the labor unions that are worried about the new push for Walmarts and other big box in infill areas, that now they can get that streamlining. And of course, we all know that a lot of our municipalities will bend over backwards to try to fit a Walmart into a community where it doesn't belong. So I would say they were actually even more upset, and it was sort of sadly comical. They actually worked to get new language that would have made it harder for a Walmart to kind of slip through in this. But it was too late in the session. I mean, it was really crazy the last day. It was like a Wild West of session. The bill already went through in practically at midnight, and then all of a sudden they try to push it through again with this anti-Walmart language after it had already been approved at 1 a.m. And unfortunately the legislators weren't having anything to do with that. So I kind of feel, labor, frankly, there's a lot more influence in the Capitol than the environmental community, sadly. It's something we need to work on. But I feel like they got to sort of see how we usually feel in things getting beaten up at the end of session.
And so there's a question about how are you planning to bring planners at city and counties to be part of the conversation? And so one of the things that happened that was kind of amazing a few years, now it's over a year and a half old, is that SCAG actually developed a public health subcommittee around looking at the sustainable community strategies. So there has been a lot of push at the departments. The City of Los Angeles is doing a health and wellness element for their plans, and I think engaging at that level is really important. I also think, meetings with the planning commissioners and talking about why health is important. And then the other part of that is really working, I think, with the governor's office and the Office of Planning and Research, who have expressed a real interest in this concept of health in all policies. And I think that those are some of the areas where there's work happening that we could expand and strengthen to push for these health considerations in planning decisions. And again, if you are interested in looking at what some of that work is, you can give me a call. I could send you some of the work that the Health in All Policies is doing. And again, I think and different counties are in different stages of this development. But I think pushing on SCAG is one way, because then you sort of get to a lot of different, which is the Southern California Association of Governments. It's a place where you actually get to the different counties. So you don't just get to Los Angeles, but you do get to Riverside, you get to these other areas, and just sort of building a very strong drumbeat that you cannot separate planning decisions from health.
So a couple other questions. One, what else can we do? I mean, we've laid out a lot of things, until that's something that I think all of us are doing in Sacramento. We are still somewhat recovering from session, and we have to go through our process of evaluating, how things went and kind of where we go from here. One of the things that I think is challenging in Sacramento, and I know the person who asked that question who works a lot in in Sacramento as well, is there's a lot of groups that play in Sacramento. There is a Green California Coalition that tries to get them organized. There's a lot of these offshoots on specific issues. So there's GWAC that focuses on climate, and we've got CEQA Works and all these others. We've got to do a better job in Sacramento of figuring out how we can take advantage of all these amazing groups that are working. But right now, I think there's the sense that we trip over each other more than actually build our power collectively. And that's something that I'm trying to push in Sacramento and having Green California. Green California does a summit every year that, frankly, I'd like to focus more on how we work better together rather than, your typical issue area, what's going on with water. I think groups just need to hear from folks on the ground, because the reality is, like I said, you guys actually have more power collectively than we have in Sacramento. And the best thing we can do in Sacramento is do a better job of harnessing the in-district stuff, because I know, like I said, coming from that local where I had incredibly strong relationships with all my local assembly members and senators in San Diego, because I knew them from when they were on the planning commission before they even got to city council, and then moved on to, the county, and then moved on to the assembly. And they're the ones who have to come back and live with you after they're out of the assembly and see you at the market and the restaurant. And we've got to do a better job of in-district organizing. And I think we in Sacramento have to figure out how to take advantage of the groups on the ground. And I think that's what you guys can do that would be most helpful. Another question that little bit related is just what are some of the other CEQA resources and workshops? Like I said, right now, I would go to I'm sure there's other groups as well. PCL has a lot of information on our website, pcl.org. CEQA Works website also has a lot of information, including fact sheets and things like that. One thing that we don't have on there, that this is a good reminder, and I'll have to make a note of for myself, is we should have a calendar of CEQA-related activities. I emailed out, for example, to our CEQA Works group about this webinar. I also emailed that there's going to be a big CEQA continuing legal education CLE for attorneys conference in San Francisco in December. But I'll try to work on getting a calendar up as part of CEQA Works as well, so people can stay in the loop or attend workshops, things like that.
Yeah, and I think in terms of what else we can do, we were sort of debriefing on what we did well and what we didn't do well, and we realized that one of the things that we didn't do, mostly because of bandwidth, is do a lot more communication to our to the sort of network of community organizations and community advocates that we work with on a much more regular basis and early. And one of the things that we've been doing over the next, we have about 15 legislative visits, and we're going to talk to folks and thanking them for good votes and good things that happened, talking to them about what are your priorities for next year, and then really talking about, what we feel are some of the bad and good things that happen at the end of the session. And it's proven. We've had 3 visits so far, set up, and certainly the one visit that we've actually done has been really very useful in that relationship building. And so sometimes when end of session is so traumatic that we end up not wanting to think about anything again until January, and this time, no, these are the months that are really important because they're home, they're in their district, and they like hearing thank you so much for the driver's license bill, thank you for upping the minimum wage, but this we think is going to be a problem for our communities, and I think those are some really important things that we should be doing between now and January, and then in January really sort of starting those visits again in both in the district but also in Sacramento, and there's real power in bringing folks from our communities to Sacramento, both in terms of what it does to the legislatures, but also what the message it sends to the sort of Sacramento-based groups, that they sort of ignore our issues at their own peril.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and I was just making a couple notes to myself of things to do. One is to get a calendar on. Another thing that I need to think about is whether we should have sort of a CEQA vote count on the website so people can go, if you're meeting members, to know if they're good or bad, because it's not that easy to, you can do it, you can go to Ledge Info, but it takes some work where we can actually put together. The problem with CEQA that's so weird is it's kind of hard to do that, because like I said, half the time the quote-unquote good votes on CEQA are folks that actually are just saying that the chipping away of CEQA isn't going far enough and we just need to get rid of CEQA altogether, but we may try to figure out a way to do that and have like a CEQA vote count.
Yeah, I started doing that, and I found the same thing. And I think the key message is that there are some legislators that should be on our side on this, and that is where I think we need to do a lot better job of meeting and talking with them so that they can actually be champions. And we had a few that actually did ask questions, who were not comfortable voting on bills that they hadn't seen, and I think we should thank them for that. I think since Bruce is here next to me, I can say, it would be great to have a division of labor where you are helping us produce some of those education pieces, some of those communication pieces, and the ways that communities can engage, given that many of us on the community side have less resources to do that.
Excellent. Any other questions? Because Marta and I, I'm sure, can go on just talking forever on CEQA.
Oh, you know what? Yeah, actually, before we, one of the things that we didn't talk about, and I think is important, and I've seen the list of folks on the call, is we did not talk about some of the other bills that passed that ended up having some CEQA language in them, and that would be SB4. SB4 was the bill that attempted to regulate fracking, hydraulic fracturing, and these kinds of oil recovery systems. And it started off early in the year as a bill that actually contained some really bad language around gagging doctors. Doctors would not be allowed to actually talk to patients or other consulting physicians when they suspected someone had been exposed to fracking chemicals. So we were able to get that taken out of the bill, but in the last moments of, literally the last moments of session, there were some CEQA exemptions also put into that bill, and I think folks are still trying to understand what those mean. And one is that it would allow DOGGR, which is the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources, to rely on existing CEQA documentation to determine that no further environmental review is needed. So it could mean that in places where this is already happening and they've done some sort of review, they wouldn't have to do another one if they wanted to dig new wells. And I think that will, particularly in Southern California, where there is lots of oil that is now accessible through these new enhanced oil recovery systems, we should be tracking what that's going to mean. And I think we're still trying to understand what the legality of those kinds of exemptions are. But you see why CEQA plays a role in so many other things that relate to, how we build our environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. CEQA really is the sort of fabric law that catches all these other laws, and often is the enforcement mechanism. When, well, fracking is, totally underregulated now, there's still, opportunities to provide challenges through CEQA. And I think what this highlights is, a couple things. One, the dangers of trying to get all these bills done at the last second. The author of SB4, Fran Pally, is a very environmental author. SB4 itself was a very controversial bill throughout session. It was a fracking regulation bill that had some good things. It had some industry concessions to try to move it through. And it really, unfortunately, and you see this a lot, it split the environmental community. There were a lot of groups that really didn't like SB4. They thought it could be counterproductive. There were groups that thought some regulation was better than none. And that is never a place of power in Sacramento. When a legislator, hears from four groups coming in on the environmental saying this is a good bill and four saying it's bad, and there's no unity, it really puts everybody in a bad position. What was sadly somewhat heartening is when this language got put in, and I really don't think it was the intent to circumvent. I think it was bad drafting in the wee hours of the night to try to get something through. That's just my own interpretation. Maybe there was bad intent. I don't think there was. It actually unified all those groups that had previously been for SB4, to give ourselves credit, and the community came out against. And everybody saw the same concerns that Martha pointed out, which is the way it was drafted. It could be read as exempting fracking from CEQA, which I do not think was the intent, but can have huge, huge impacts in communities up and down the state. We're trying to work on a fix-it bill next year. There's already conversations that this SB4 was such a debacle that we actually just need to be unified behind a moratorium for fracking, which hopefully a lot of groups here would be supportive of. But it just shows the danger of the way the legislative session, and again, what Martha was saying, how CEQA touches on so many things that we're working on.
So someone asked, what are the prospects of ever including HIA review as part of CEQA? I don't know. I think it's an important fight to have, whether we win or not. I think it is, it's actually one of those things that we could do proactively. And in some ways, I think that given some of the questions and meetings I've had, that it might really resonate with many progressive Dems.
Yeah, I think if we get organized, it's nothing that's going to happen overnight, without a doubt. A lot of these things you got to push for years before they get through. But I don't like to go in with a defeatist attitude. I don't see there any reason that we couldn't and shouldn't push it. And when we started the session and started working on this displacement language, frankly, I never thought it would get anywhere, and it got into the bill until the last day of session. Now, some would argue maybe we were being played. I hope that wasn't the case. But if we could get that far on that, and we're already in conversations of still having OPR do that displacement study even without having the legislative mandate and having that incorporated into the guidelines, I don't want to say that doing the health assessment is not something that's possible. I think it's something we should be pushing, and I think it's important to change the dynamic, because the way CEQA gets talked about in Sacramento is enviros love it just the way that it is. Business thinks it's the worst thing ever, therefore we need to weaken it to be in the middle, cut the baby a la Solomon. And I think it's really important that we change the dynamic to say CEQA could be a whole lot stronger, as great a tool as it is. Mm-hmm. And I think health assessment is an important part of that.
And I want to sort of, I'm thinking of the bills that we've worked on that have taken like 10 years, 7 years, and this is a shout out to the folks at Clean Water Action and others. Worked, I think, 6 or 7 years to pass a bill that just said we had a human right to clean water. But that was a fight. Many of us participated and were led by, I believe, the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. And it took 6 or 7 tries. And so, that's an important precedent. So I agree with Bill. We just have to do it. And I think we could really build a really strong community voice around this, because at the end of the day, this is what communities want. They want decisions in Sacramento that actually make things better on the ground. And those health impact assessments can be really important tools for making those projects better.
One note, can everybody see the Okay, so everyone can see. So, but I will point out, and it is correct that in SB4, the CEQA exemption, and there's still some debate on the language. It was drafted so kind of quickly what exactly it means, and I was actually just talking to the committee consultant, very well known and a good guy and a friend of the environment in the Capitol, Bill Craven, and they don't have the same interpretation that we have in NRDC and others. So I think there's still a lot of confusion about the language. We do think that it is likely that exemption that we interpret as an exemption is limited to the interim period until DOGGR actually gets regs in place. And pointed out correctly, there are groups working really aggressively to try to fix some of that language, and have not been part of that dialogue yet. But hopefully that we'll be able to fix that, and hopefully it can be done very quickly.
And I think that's one of the lessons. I mean, you by the end of session, the fight's been really heated, and then and we often say you don't get to have another bite of the apple, but I think we often are forced to do cleanup language and fixes, and so again it speaks to the need to be consistently present and build that and for us the need to really continue to build that community presence in Sacramento.
Any
Great.
other?
And if there's sorry, Bruce, this is Will Ng over at the endowment. It sounds like we were doing the same check just to see if there are any additional questions. And giving folks another few seconds. Looks like that pretty much wraps up our Q&A. And actually, I think especially the last couple of questions and Bruce and Martha's getting into kind of what's the best way to engage moving forward, related legislation that wasn't specific to the King's legislation, and the CEQA pieces in that are actually a good transition into our closing. And before I do that, just wanted to thank everyone that's participating on this. I know there's a number of people that made time in their schedules, and just wanted to thank everyone for their interest, as well as give another thanks to both my colleague Christy for putting this together, and for Martha and Bruce for putting together such a great and informative presentation. And along those lines, we just wanted to take a quick, in closing, just take a quick step back and note that this webinar is part of our kind of ongoing effort to do a couple of things really, and one is share information amongst our partners, and frankly educate ourselves here at the endowment as well, from the folks that know best, as well as connect our partners, and that's connecting folks between the sites, but also connecting people that are working at both the state, the regional, and also the local level, and that's something that we've heard through past convenings and meetings that people are looking for. Along those lines, in terms of education and information sharing, I just want to put a quick note out there to folks that we are convening our next land use community or practice meeting in November. I think that's set right now for the 14th. Is that right, Christy?
We'll be shooting for the 14th.
Shooting for the 14th. Okay. So keep an eye out for your emails, in your emails, and we will update folks as that gets a little bit closer and as we firm that up. So outside of the learning piece, and I think Bruce and Martha did a very nice job of getting to this during the last part of the Q&A, as I mentioned. I was going to note that we see this as part of sort of our ongoing education and connectiveness work, not necessarily to have an agenda that speaks to collective action, but we know that that's something that folks are interested in, and we know that that's what drives the work. So separate from just sort of our purely informational and webinars to connect people, if folks are interested in getting involved in more advocacy or kind of collective action, I think you heard about different organizations that are at the table, and it looks like from what we have up on the screen as well, there's contact information for following up with both Bruce or Martha. Sorry about that. So unless there are any further questions or comments, I think that wraps us up. Okay. If there aren't any, then thanks everyone again for making the time.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody.
Thanks.